They told me they were tapped out. That's the exact phrase my father used, tapped out the same week I found out my son might never walk without pain again. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I work as a pediatric nurse in Columbus, Ohio, and I have a 16-year-old son named Mason who is, without any exaggeration, the single best thing that has ever happened to me. I had him young. Too young, according to my parents. His father left when Mason was 2, and I spent the next 14 years doing every single thing on my own. Night shifts, double shifts, picking up overtime whenever the unit needed someone. I missed school plays. I missed soccer games. I missed things I can't get back. But Mason never went without. He always had food, clothes, a warm bed, and a mother who showed up even when she was running on 3 hours of sleep and cold coffee. That's the part I need you to understand before I tell you the rest. I did not ask my parents for help lightly. I am not someone who asks for help at all. When Mason was 14, he started complaining about back pain. At first I thought it was growing pains. He'd shot up almost 4 inches in 1 year. But the pain didn't go away. It got worse. He stopped wanting to play basketball with his friends. He started sleeping on the floor because it hurt less than the mattress. I brought him to his pediatrician, who referred us to a specialist, who sent us for an MRI, and that's when we found out. Mason had a condition called adolescent idiopathic scoliosis, and his curve had progressed to 63 degrees. The specialist sat across from me in her office with a spine model on her desk and explained it clearly and without softening. At this stage, without surgical correction, the curve would continue to worsen. It was already beginning to affect lung function. In 5 to 10 years, if left untreated, he could face serious cardiac and pulmonary complications. The surgery, a posterior spinal fusion, would stop the progression, correct the curve, and give him a normal life. The out-of-pocket costs after my insurance, $22,000. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before I could drive. I went home. I looked at my accounts. I had $4,000 in savings, a car payment, rent, Mason's braces that weren't finished yet, and a credit card I'd been slowly paying down for 2 years. I ran the numbers 6 different ways and got the same answer every time. I could not do this alone. So I did the thing I never do. I called my parents. My parents live 40 minutes away in the house my brother and I grew up in. My father retired early from his job in insurance. My mother never worked outside the home. They are not wealthy in the flashy sense, but they have always been comfortable. Paid off house, no debt. A retirement account my father referenced proudly at every holiday dinner. They took a trip to Portugal the previous spring. They drove newer cars. They were, by any reasonable definition, fine. I called my mother first. I explained everything, the diagnosis, the specialist's recommendation, the timeline, the cost. I was calm. I had the paperwork in front of me. I told her I wasn't asking for the full amount, just help. Whatever they could do. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the timer on my phone. When she came back, she said she needed to talk to my father and she'd call me tomorrow. My father called the next evening. He was kind about it, which almost made it worse. He said they were so sorry about Mason, that they loved him, that this was a terrible situation. And then he said, they just didn't have the liquidity right now. That word liquidity landed like something cold and foreign in the middle of a conversation about my son's spine. He said they were tapped out, that they'd had some unexpected expenses, that maybe I could look into a payment plan with the hospital, or a medical loan, or a fundraiser online. I thanked him. I don't know why I thanked him, but I did. And then I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table and I let myself cry for exactly 10 minutes, because Mason was in the next room and I didn't want him to hear. I started a fundraiser. I shared it everywhere. Facebook, Instagram, the neighborhood app, my coworkers' group chat. I was humiliated in a way I'd never felt before, putting my son's medical situation on the internet with a dollar amount attached to it. But I did it. Within 3 weeks, strangers had donated over $11,000. People I hadn't spoken to since high school. Nurses from my unit who barely knew me outside of 12-hour shifts. Mason's former basketball coach. A woman in Michigan who said she'd had the same surgery at 15 and wanted to help. Every notification made me feel two things at once, grateful beyond words, and furious at the people who should have been first. We closed the gap with a medical loan. Mason had his surgery 8 months after his diagnosis. It went well. His curve corrected to 18 degrees. He was in the hospital for 4 days, in recovery for 3 months, and by the following spring he was shooting hoops in the driveway again. I never told him how we paid for it. He knew about the fundraiser. He didn't know about the loan, and he didn't know his grandparents had said no. Life moved forward, the way it does whether you're ready or not. I paid down the loan. Mason turned 16. Things were quiet in that careful way where you know something is waiting underneath the surface, but you choose not to look. Then my cousin got married, and I found out. It wasn't something anyone said to me directly. My cousin and I were close growing up, and at her rehearsal dinner she leaned over and mentioned, without thinking anything of it, that it had been so generous of my parents to cover the cost of the venue. I smiled and nodded, and asked her something about the florist. Inside, something went very still. After the wedding, I started asking careful questions. Not of my parents, I've never been able to confront them directly, and I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. I asked my cousin. I asked my aunt. I pieced it together over the course of about 2 months. My parents had contributed $60,000 toward my brother's wedding. $60,000. His venue, the catering, the honeymoon to Tuscany. My brother, who has a good job, who owns a home, who does not have a child with a medical condition, received $60,000 as a wedding gift the same year my parents told me they were tapped out. The wedding had taken place 4 months after my father's phone call. 4 months after he used the word liquidity to explain why he couldn't help his grandson. I need to tell you something about my brother, because this isn't just about money. My brother and I are not close. We were never close, even as children. He was always the easier one, quieter, more agreeable, the one who came home for every holiday without being asked, who called my parents every Sunday, who never did anything complicated or inconvenient. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I've had enough therapy to understand the dynamic clearly. I was the one who left early, who got pregnant young, who needed things. He was the one who reflected back to them everything they wanted to see. I don't think my brother is a bad person, but I do think he knew. When I finally confronted my mother, not my father, because I knew my father would deflect, and I needed to look someone in the eyes, she cried. She said they'd wanted to do something special for my brother's wedding, that it was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, that they'd assumed I would figure out Mason's situation on my own, because I always did, that they didn't know it would be that hard. She said they were sorry. I told her I understood, and in the cold, functional way a person understands something that has broken something else permanently, I did. I understood exactly what I meant to them, and what my brother meant to them, and I understood that no apology was going to rearrange that order. I stopped going to Sunday dinners. I stopped calling. I was polite at Christmas for Mason's sake, because he loved his grandparents, and I wasn't going to take that from him. But something between me and my parents had closed like a door, quietly, without a scene, and I did not try to open it again. That was 2 years ago. Last October, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening. Mason was doing homework at the kitchen table, and I stepped outside to take it. She was crying before she got through the first sentence. My father had been hospitalized. A kidney disease he'd apparently been managing quietly for several years had progressed into end-stage renal failure. He'd been on dialysis for months, which I had not known, because we did not talk anymore, and he was now on the transplant list. His blood type was rare. His condition was deteriorating faster than expected. The transplant coordinator had reached out to family members about living donation. My mother asked me if I would be tested. I stood on my back porch in the October cold, and I listened to her ask me this, and I felt about 15 different things simultaneously, and none of them were simple. Here is what I want to be honest about. Because this channel is called Revenge Sagas, and you're probably expecting me to say I felt satisfaction. I didn't. I felt something much more complicated than that. I felt grief. Not for the situation, for the version of my parents I had needed them to be when Mason was sick. I felt that loss again, fresh, standing in the cold air with my mother crying on the phone. I told her I would think about it. I went back inside. Mason looked up from his homework and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I made dinner. I put on something mindless on TV, and I sat with what my mother had asked me, turning it over the way you turn over something heavy when you're trying to find the edge that lets you pick it up. I went to see my therapist that week. I want to say that clearly, because I think it matters. I did not make this decision in anger, and I did not make it in a vacuum. I sat in that office, and I said every true thing out loud. That I was angry. That I thought what my parents had done was a betrayal I hadn't fully recovered from. That I also did not want my father to die. That both things were true at the same time, and I didn't know what to do with that. My therapist asked me one question that I kept coming back to. She said, "Who do you want to be when this is over? Not what do my parents deserve. Not what does karma dictate. Who do you want to be?" I called the transplant center and scheduled my evaluation. What I did not know, what I could not have anticipated, was what happened 3 days later. Mason came home from school and set his backpack down and stood in the kitchen doorway with the look he gets when he's decided something. He's always been that way. Even as a small child, he would think quietly for days and then arrive at a conclusion fully formed, like he'd been running a program in the background the whole time. He said, "I know about Grandpa, and I know what you're deciding." I asked him how, and he said Grandma had called him. I made a note of that, the fact that my mother had gone to my 16-year-old son, and I felt a flicker of something I pushed aside, because that wasn't the conversation we were having. He said he'd already called the transplant center himself. He was 16, which is old enough in Ohio to consent to certain medical evaluations with a parent's knowledge. He'd looked it up. He wanted to be tested too. I sat down at the kitchen table. Mason sat across from me. I asked him why. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know they didn't help when I needed surgery. You never told me, but I figured it out about a year ago. And I've been thinking about it for a long time. And I decided that I don't want to be someone who lets a person die because of something that happened before I was old enough to be in the room." He said it exactly like that. I wrote it down afterward so I wouldn't misremember it. I didn't try to talk him out of it. I don't think I had the right to. What I said was, "We do this together. Both of us get evaluated, and then we make a decision together with full information." He agreed. We were both tested the following week. The results came back on a Thursday afternoon. I was at work when the coordinator called. I stepped into the medication room and shut the door. I was not a match. Mason was. I stood in that medication room for a long time. I thought about the night before Mason's surgery 2 years ago, when I'd sat on the edge of his bed and told him everything was going to be okay, and I'd meant it with a certainty I'd manufactured specifically for him because he needed to hear it. I thought about the fundraiser, and the strangers from Michigan, and the medical loan I'd paid off 8 months ago. I thought about my father's voice on the phone saying tapped out. I thought about Tuscany, and then I thought about what Mason had said at the kitchen table. I don't want to be someone who lets a person die. When I got home that evening, I sat Mason down and told him the results. I told him I wasn't a match. I told him he was. And then I told him that this was his decision, and his alone, not mine, not his grandparents, his, and that whatever he chose, I would stand behind him completely. He didn't answer right away. He asked me one question. He said, "What do you think Grandpa would have done if it were you?" I told him the truth. I said I didn't know. I said I'd spent 2 years trying to figure that out and I still didn't have an answer I could trust. He nodded slowly. He looked at the table. And then he looked up and said, "I think I want to do it. Not for them. For me. Because I don't want to carry this." We called the transplant coordinator the next morning. The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later. My brother drove in from out of state and stayed at my parents' house. I saw him once in the hospital waiting room and we exchanged about 4 sentences. He looked like a man who was aware of something he didn't want to name, and I didn't push. Whatever conversation he and I eventually have, it won't be in a hospital. My father's surgery went well. Mason came through his donation without complications. I sat next to his recovery bed for 7 hours straight, and when he woke up, the first thing he said was that he was hungry, which made me laugh in the ugly, the relieved way you only laugh when the thing you were terrified of didn't happen. My mother came to Mason's room later that evening. She stood at the door and she looked at my son in the bed with his IV and his hospital gown and she started crying. She said thank you. She said she didn't deserve it. She said she was so sorry, not just for the transplant situation, not just for this week, but for 2 years ago. For the word liquidity, for all of it. I let her finish. And then I said something that surprised me, because I hadn't planned it. I said, I forgive you, but I need you to understand something. Mason made this choice for himself, not for you, not for me, not because he owed you anything. And if you want any kind of relationship with him going forward, you will honor that by never making him feel like he's owed anything in return. She said she understood. I don't know if she does. I think she wants to. I think there's a difference. My father came to see Mason before we were discharged. He walked slowly, pushing his IV pole, looking like a version of himself that had been turned down slightly in every direction. He stood at the foot of the bed, and he looked at Mason for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "You didn't have to do this." Mason said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. I think it was enough. I want to be careful about how I end this, because I've seen how these stories go. There's supposed to be a clean lesson, a neat arc, some satisfying moral at the finish line. I don't think that's what real life actually gives you. My parents and I are not close. I don't think we will be. Not in the way I spent most of my 20s hoping for. That hope is something I've had to grieve, and I've mostly done it, and I'm still doing it sometimes late at night. My brother and I haven't spoken since the hospital. Maybe someday. Maybe not. What I do have is Mason, who is 16 years old and already more of a person than most adults I know, who looked at a situation designed to make him bitter and chose something harder than bitterness. I don't take credit for that. He did that himself. I have my unit at the hospital, and my coworkers who donated money they didn't have to spare for a kid they'd never met. I have the woman from Michigan who sent $100 and a card that said I had this surgery too. He's going to be great. I have the evidence, collected over years, that the people who show up for you are not always the ones who were supposed to. The last night we were in the hospital, after visiting hours, after my parents had gone, and the floor had gotten quiet, Mason fell asleep watching something on his phone, and I sat in the chair next to his bed. The window faced east, and around 5 in the morning, the sky started to go light at the edge. That slow, gray to pink that happens before anyone's really awake to see it. I watched it happen. Mason had told me once, when he was about 11, that he liked mornings because every morning was a new version of the day. He'd said it casually, about nothing, on the way to school. I'd thought about it ever since. I thought about it again in that hospital room, watching the sky get light. Every morning is a new version of the day. That's enough. For right now, that is enough. If you've been through something like this, a family that showed up for the wrong person, or a moment where you had to decide who you wanted to be instead of what you were owed, I want to hear from you. Leave it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs it today. I'm Claire. This is Revenge Sagas, and I'll see you next time.